Okay, Sister Hani, anytime from now.
All right. Okay, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and good morning I bid to our honorable speakers, Dr. Azlin Haji Alwi and Ms. Theebashini, and to our respected audiences. So before we start this session, let us all begin with the recitation of Al-Fatiha. All right. So we meet again in this webinar series on empathy and inclusivity, where we will be addressing societal issues that are in dire need of change. In today's session, we will be discussing a prevalent issue that is domestic violence. So we have here today, we have here with us today our respectable speakers, Dr. Azlin from the Kuliah of Psychology at IIM and Ms. Theebashini from a youth-led organization called Monster Among Us that advocates for children through youth empowerment. They will be answering all of our questions surrounding the topic of domestic abuse and enlighten us with the reality of this dire situation and why it is important for us to have this conversation. So before we begin, I would first like to introduce our speaker to the audience. So Ms. Theebashini is one of the volunteers from Monster Among Us and is actively advocating for women and children. She is currently studying at Asia Metropolitan University, AMU, majoring in medical science and is planning to specialize in cardiology. She was inspired to join MAU, a Monster Among Us, for the goals and the vision that the organization has set for, and is motivated by the desire to restore hope and give back to the community. So moving on to our second speaker, Dr. Azlin Haji Alwi is an assistant professor at the Department of Psychology, International Islamic University Malaysia, IIUM, specializing in developmental psychology. Dr. Azlin joined the department in 2013 after her completion of her PhD in 2012. Since the start of her career in IUM, Dr. Azlin has been involved in a number of research projects. These projects include research on single Malay women in Malaysia and a community-based project to empower elderly women, and many more. Several of her works have been presented at international and local conferences. In 2013, her paper, A Resilience-Based Intervention for At-Risk Adolescents, was accepted in the 10th Biennial Conference of Asian Association of Social Psychology in Yogyakarta. So we are thrilled to have such an astounding line of speakers today and believe that we will be having an insightful discussion surrounding the topic of domestic violence. So without further ado, I will pass the floor to Helmy Jasri to begin today's session.
Assalamualaikum.
Salam. Brother Helmy?
Okay. Yeah.
I think Helmy's Wi-Fi is lagging.
It's okay. Thank you so much, Sister Hani.
Okay. Yeah.
I feel very honored to be here, and as we are spreading the awareness on the domestic violence, as during this pandemic of COVID-19, this issue has been hit all over the social media, and today we have the opportunity to discuss on this topic. So the first question that I want to ask Ms. Theebashini, as you are an activist for Monster Among Us, how does your organization support the victims of the domestic abuse?
Yeah. Okay, Monster Among Us, or better known as MAU, is a youth-led organization that focuses on initiatives to combat child sexual abuse. Child sexual abuse happens when an adult forces or tricks or even manipulates a child in engaging in a sexual activity to achieve his sexual gratification. So, and child sexual abuse is just another creature of domestic abuse. We understand that domestic abuse exists within a household whereby a dominant or abusive member abuses another family member, be it physically or emotionally or even verbally. So similar to domestic abuse, child sexual abuse that happens when privates are like incestuous relationships. For instance, a father rapes his son or daughter. That is incest and domestic abuse at the same time. So MAU has always been premised on the motivation to create awareness and reliable understanding on the topic of sexual-based violence. We reach out to different communities of different ages and backgrounds to build their literacy on personal safety and empower them with knowledge that they have about their rights. Soon, we will launch a service for internet users, especially the children, to be able to make reports about online sexual crimes using an automated chatbot.
So thank you, Mr. Bashni, for the sharing. Actually, we are very grateful to have such NGOs that helping and focusing on fighting for the topic that we proposed for today. And during this pandemic time, we often hear the hashtag "Kita Jaga Kita." So with this kind of NGO who are supporting and advocating on the issues of domestic abuse. So I can say that we are grateful for it. We are so grateful for it. So the next questions, maybe we can touch on the surface before we go deeper on domestic abuse. So maybe I want to ask Dr. Azlin, what encouraged you to speak on this topic today?
Okay, suddenly it's lagging. Anyone, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Can.
Yes,
All right.
yes, Doctor.
Ahmad, right? Ahmad, what's your name? Sorry, brother.
Ahmad Dhiya or
Ahmad Dhiya. All right.
Oh, I'm
First of
Helmy
all,
Jasri.
yes, thank you so much for the invitation. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. A very good first question because I'm excited to answer that question from Ahmad Dhiya. What encouraged me? For so long since last year, I had been declining a lot of talks because I had been on leave. So I kind of like screen on certain topics that are close to my heart, such as on few projects and speaking on particularly adolescents' resilience and program intervention. But when I received this email from one of you, I was in the midst of actually watching this one crime series on domestic violence, and I was like, okay, for the past few days, this week alone, I watched a lot of domestic violence victims and the acts that followed as a result of murders of these victims. That is one. Secondly, it's not that close to my heart, but for 20 over years now, I had been in acquaintance with one I would say, abuse victim herself. So, and a few incidents up till now still affect me so much, all right? But why the victim chose to stay and put herself in such a situation is, being a psychologist myself, have to be respectful of that. But then what I learned from the experience is first, you can marry someone for all the wrong reasons. So you know that something is off, but you still continue with the relationship, with the marriage, thinking that, oh, I can change that person. Something kind of like a miracle will happen. Secondly, there are, like I said, there are early warning signs that we can see with our partner. Even like, for example, you know a guy or you know a girl for 1 week. If you only open your eyes, there are early warning signs, but we choose to ignore those signs. And the third one, what I learned was that it's not the victim's fault, although many would say it's my fault. But the abusers or the perpetrators, usually here, when on my part, my context is mostly intimate partner violence, IPV, or husband and wife domestic abuse issues or cases. But many of these abusers or these perpetrators justify their actions that their abuse or their violence or their aggressions are actually caused by these victims. All right, so I think that's from me. But I would like to make this a little bit of dialogue, kind of an informal. So I would be having few questions for you to maybe think about and then answer together with me so that we learn from each other. Because I know that you come here, Hani, Haryati, Ahmad Dhiya, and whoever, and particularly Miss Theebashini, with each of us having our own experiences. So it would be nice to hear from everyone. Okay, back to you, Ahmad Dhiya or Hani.
Yes, of course, Doctor. We are so excited to share our experience, and of course, to hear more from our speakers. And thank you so much for participating. And moving on to the next question, maybe I can also ask this to Dr. Azlin. What are the forms of domestic abuse that you can actually identify from Asia?
Yeah, the forms of, I'm going to share my slides, but can you see my slides? It's not so much of a slide, yeah, it's a lot of pictures. Yeah, the question is form of abuse, right? So I come
Yeah, what are the forms?
So I come up with a title. He loves me not, he loves me not. Sometimes we do that with a petal of what? Roses. So you know, there are many forms of abuse. So if you look at the literature particularly, there are actually 5 umbrella forms of abuse. So I'll be speaking today about those 5 umbrella forms. But okay, my question first is, to any of you, maybe you want to ponder about this. Men are victims of domestic violence as often as women are. Simple answer, yes or no. I repeat, men are victims of domestic violence as often as women are. True or false?
True.
True, Doctor.
Okay.
I say true.
True. Who else?
I would beg to differ.
Back to differ. Who says back to differ?
Me.
Okay. Men
Someone said
are not
100%.
95% is women. 95% are women who are being abused. So in 2019, if I'm not mistaken, about 340 women around January to June, something like that, only about 71 cases involving men, but 95% involved women. So sometimes you ask yourself, right? Why did he hit me? Sometimes these thinkings influence how victims view the abuse. Why did he hit me? He may do it unintentionally. He didn't mean it, so it's okay. All right. Or second, oh, he's just joking. He's just being playful. No, it's just a joke. It's nothing. I shouldn't be afraid. I shouldn't be worried about that. Or it's nothing wrong with being slapped. In one true case that I remember, someone telling me she was actually sitting, you know, sofa, but she was sitting on the floor and the husband was sitting on the sofa. You know, they were watching TV and suddenly this husband of hers just pinched her head, you know, just did like this, kind of like a slap out of nowhere. And then this is not just just a one-off incident. These are just many incidents. So many women experience domestic abuse in the form of first physical abuse, such as hitting, like biting, punching, or choking. They can choke at first jokingly. All right, it can turn severe when they choke and then you really cannot breathe. Second, it can be also emotional. Emotional is what Malaysian women usually, through research, recorded or reported having been experienced, like intimidation, the use of making you feel degraded. This is where I want to share with you, yeah? Did you see this? These are only few of the stories I could find. This lady who has a degree, she said, he used to tell me, despite my degree, for someone with such intellect, you know, you are pretty stupid. And I started to doubt myself, question myself, and it was just at the beginning. And this lady here, she survived the abuse. So she's a domestic abuse survivor. This lady here is actually a model. All right, she came from Rwanda, if I'm not mistaken. Her name was Lina Keza. So she already reported to the police, and this was one of her statements to the police. She said, I believe that I will be at risk of significant harm if the respondent is not ordered to stop immediately. Unfortunately, she did not survive the violence. So the ex-husband stalked her and killed her. So these are just few of many cases of violence that will lead to murder. So when we talk about forms of violence, it can be physical, it can be emotional, degrading you, thinking, making you feel you are worthless, you are hopeless, you cannot do anything about your life, that you are, you know, intellectual deficient. It can be financially also. So how a perpetrator abuse a victim is through control of the money. All right, sometimes millionaires or very rich people, they can even control their spouse by, this is one true cases, yeah. It's actually a wealthy family. So when the wife went shopping, the husband would want to know where the receipts, what was being bought, and he wanted to know every details of the expenses. This is true financial abuse. Sexual, just like what Ms. Theebashini said just now, this is also one form of abuse. It's where the woman is non-consenting or being coerced by the husband or by the boyfriend through sexual activities. And social isolation also. So many of those women who are being abused, the guys or the perpetrators who abuse may control them by making them isolated from their social supports like friends, family members, or even relatives. So they can control and have full control of the wife or the girlfriend. And one that I would like to share as well is spiritual abuse. Spiritual abuse is when the perpetrator uses religion or spiritual faith to control the victim. So these are few of these are the five, like I said, the five umbrella forms of abuse. But they cannot do harm so much to the woman or to the victims, except if there is a frequency. So it can happen over years, duration, and also severity of the abuse. So many forms usually take precedence, or it take few of the forms to be committed at the same time. So it can be emotional with physical, it can be physical with spiritual, or it can occur in any forms of that abuse. Thanks, back to you.
Wow, such an interesting sharing. So now we know that a few of the main idea that we want to discuss today about, we have Dr. Azlin have already covered the forms of domestic abuse that we can actually identify in such cases in Malaysia. And also through the explanation just now, we can also caught that how can the abuser affect the well-being of the victims. And also it's also covered that why that it is common to see that women are always a victim of domestic abuse. Thank you, Dr. Azlin, for that. But before we want to ask the next question to Ms. Theebashini, first, I would like to ask Dr. Azlin about maybe you can tell us the main causes of domestic abuse cases in Malaysia.
Okay, like many other issues or cases based on research and literature review, there are multiple factors that cause this abuse. One of them I would like to call actually couple factors. But in another context, it is also known as dyadic context. What does dyadic context means? It means that the features of the relationship. So many of research done in Malaysia, they looked at simple demographic that cause this abuse. So what was found from many of this research is first, the household income may be below 3,000. All right, that is, I think, a study done 1 or 2 years back. And in one of the studies I found, it is about 2,000. So this abuse usually occur in a household where the socio-economic status is quite low. Second is low marital satisfaction, low harmony, miscommunication, and maybe wife or husband is simply not happy with each other, and different family background or lack of religion. But if you look in the Malaysian context, there is also one. Okay, it's not here. It says that bad temper or anger issue is one of the main causes of domestic violence in Malaysia. So that would fall under individual determinants. I divide that into two. One, which is perpetrator factors, or perpetrator is the abuser himself. One is because of physiological factors. So Ahmad, who else? Haryati Ibrahim, I saw your name here. Okay.
Muhammad Helmy bin Jasri.
So, honey, we being girls, Miss Theebashini, sometimes the males would like to say, oh, why are you married? Why are you so angry today? Tak ada mood, no mood today because you have your period ka? So, it's the same with the perpetrators. They do have hormonal imbalance, they so-called it. So if you look at neuropsychology, or when you look at the biological causes of domestic violence, we cannot rule out that these hormonal changes, particularly in male, we talk about testosterone, that would make, or it can be a precursor to domestic abuse. Second is, of course, psychopathology, personality traits, like what I said before, bad temper, anger issues. It can be, of course, because of alcohol and drug abuse. But be careful when we talk about alcohol and drug abuse, it does not necessarily influence the abuse itself, but it can distort the thinking, decision making, or the situation. All right, it can exacerbate into into abuse or violence. I remember when I was in my hometown years before I did my PhD, I was doing my voluntary work in one of the hospitals. So we worked very closely in NGO. At that time, I wasn't that really understand, what really happened. But one of the counselors who worked with me, she always said, because there were a lot of domestic violence abuse. So she always said to me, you know what, when you know that the guy or the husband come back drunk, you don't do anything or you don't confront, because that would endanger yourself or it would pose a danger to you. So drug and alcohol abuse may also contribute to domestic abuse, but it's complex. All right, the relationship is still complex. It had been shown not to lead to violent episode, but it acts only as a situational factors. The most is sex and power motives. All right. Sometimes you think when the guy that you are with is being extremely jealous of you, or use their strengths or aggression to hurt you or stop you from doing something, the victims misunderstood this as being that, oh, you love me, therefore you act such a way. So particularly those, again, in they call it the cyclic stage of domestic violence. um, it calls honeymoon stage. So during honeymoon stage ni, when the guy is being overly jealous or hurt you, like pinch or simply slap you a bit, you would think that, oh, this will pass. All right, but because it's cyclic, it would advance to another stage. They call that stage as tension building phase. Okay, so, and then sex and power motives is that when you think that he loves you, but it's everything about sex and power. That's why, although the abusers or the husbands, in my context I'm talking about, they seem like they don't want to let you go. They cannot let you go. Or you don't leave me. If you leave me, I'm going to commit suicide. This happen, yeah, a lot of times. Or if you leave me, I'm going to end my life. You shouldn't leave me. And you think that this is love. Actually, it's not love. It's just how they want you to submit to them, and then they want you to obey and just be with them because they just want you, and they just want to feel in control. Victims' characteristics is another individual determinants, particularly with women we are talking about here. First, they say it's ethnicity, but again, research vary in the Malaysian context. Some says it's Indian, Miss Theebashini, that would be prone to being abused. But in another study, I also see that Chinese is double at risk of being abused compared to the Malays. Second level of education, I said this again before, right? Lower education level of both perpetrators and victims, exposure to forms of prior abuse, and attitude towards violence, because we are in patriarchal culture or belief. Sometimes the women think that it's okay or it's acceptable if the man slap me because he wants to discipline me. All right, and then the culture sometimes accept that as being husband and wife private issue. And lastly, of course, societal factors. Societal factors is encompassing religious belief. Sometimes the women feel that, oh, this may be just challenges, ujian, but in Islam, it doesn't allow even a husband to abuse the wives. Second, patriarchal beliefs, like I said, media portrayal also is one of the contributing factors to violence. When they normalize violence on TV, kids watch, adults watch, oh, it's okay, all right? It's cool to abuse wives or use aggression to punish victims, all right? So, and finally, is past exposure. So we're talking about social learning theory here, meaning that if the husbands or the wives are being the products of a household where they see or observe violence all the time between their parents, then they would grow up to also mimic this violent behavior in their relationship, husband or wives. Thank you. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Brother Helmi and Azlin. The next question that I want to ask to Ms. Theebashini, as the domestic abuse victims can be any part of the family, which will include the children. And as you mentioned, your organization is concerned about the children. So how should we interfere and provide help for the children?
Okay, thank you. Okay, let us define some important things first. Any person below the age of 18 is a child because they're like minors and underage. So how do we interfere and help? Easy, interfere. Just interfere. The good neighbor principle, hold on to that. There is no such thing as like jangan jaga tepi kain orang, or oh itu aib dia lah, jangan bongkarkan, or like ala biasalah tu, dia memang garang sikit dengan anak dia. So the terrible consequences of us not interfering is that this child is traumatized for life. And when the child grow up unintended and unscared for, the saddest thing would be to see this child continue the vicious cycle. So interfere as soon as you can. If you are suspicious of domestic abuse happening, call Talian Kase, I think it's 15999, and make the report. You can do it anonymously if you fear for your safety. Reach out to NGOs like Women AIDS Organization or Women's Center for Change in Penang if you do not know what to do. One wrong mindset is that we need to change today is that you do not need to know everything. It's okay if you do not know how to help, but the only expected step of yours is to extend the help that they deserve to them. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Theebashini. Now that we understand that the victims can also be, as mentioned Brother Ahmad Dhiya just now, the victims can also be in any part of the family members. Of course, Dr. Azlin have been explaining on the victims are prone to be women, and in some cases, the victims are also husbands. And also, Ms. Theebashini shared to us that the children are also the victims, and the examples of the stereotypes that is mingling around in our society, like jangan jaga tepi kain orang, right, Mr. Bashini? And yes, of course, our people also have these kinds of thoughts, you know, and because of these stereotypes, they think that they shouldn't have interfere in in other people's business. But our concern is these stereotypes allows child abuse to happen, and this is not okay in our society. So maybe I can direct this question also to Dr. Azlin. How can victims reach out for help safely without putting themselves in danger? Because what has been shared by Ms. Theebashini just now was how society can interfere. But first, the victims also have to reach out for help, right?
Kalau ramai Al-Masih Hayyun. Dan Jesus Christ pula, Jesus kita panggil Isa, Christ kita panggil Al-Masih. So kalau Jesus Christ,
I heard a radio. Is everything okay? Okay.
Brother Muhammad, can you please unmute your microphone? Thank you.
All right. The question, I think you jumped the question, how can victims reach out for help without putting themselves in danger, right? Maybe
yes,
can, yeah, so like what Ms. Theebashini said just now, there are few hotlines which are available 24/7. But in the situation of domestic abuse victims, concerning wives or women, the hotlines to be reached out to would be the WAO, Women AIDS Organization. There is also Talian Kase, like what Sister Ms. Theebashini said just now. There is also a safety plan. All right, safety plan is actually available provided by these NGOs on how to reach out safely to others when they are in that situation. But can I just share with you something first? All right, what is the experience of these abuse victims actually before they can reach out or when they try to reach out? And these come up to my Facebook post last night while I was, you know, just chilling out. All right. So if you're Malay, you can read this, I guess. Those of you international students, let me just translate that this lady, she's married and it's already the 4th year of the marriage, and she has 2 children. And at that particular currently she is pregnant with the 3rd one, and ever since she got married, a week after, the husband already used physical abuse. So like kicking was like, she said, quote unquote, was like food to me. So she said, I pity my children. I do not know what to do. I'm not interested in the incident at all. I want to bring you guys to the comments posted by 2 of those. Now, there are like 100 over comments. I browsed through, and to my surprise, one of these commentators was actually working in the mental health services. But many of these comments actually are putting the blame on the woman, all right, and degrading. So when you want to reach out, being a violent or abused domestic victims, it's not easy to reach out, all right. And apart from that, there are a lot of factors that make the victim stay in the marriage. But the question just now said, how can you go? What is it just now? How could you reach out, all right, for help? Firstly, identify the use and level of violence. So when I deal with one of the cases of domestic abuse violence, my concern is mostly of the safety of the victims. So identify the use and level of violence. Is he or not, sorry, is he or she, can be Sheila, but here my context is a he, okay? So is he using physical or just verbal threats? So if it's verbal threats, I would always say to the victims of violence, try to ensure that you don't encourage that violence. But it's not as easy to say that, because sometimes the trigger can be the drama that they watch on TV. All right, out of nowhere, they watch a drama that would spark something in the husband, and then suddenly the husband becomes aggressive. All right. Secondly, identify safe areas in the house. So meaning that if you can go to a door, and in one of the literature it says, make yourself smaller. I don't know this, but I would assume that you make yourself smaller. You can go to a corner. You just try to make yourself invisible to the perpetrator, and then get your phone accessible if that would be safe for you. And then there are a lot of these guides are based on the WHO website that abuse victims can read more on how to protect themselves without posing anything endangering their lives and their children. Thank you. Back to you guys.
Thank you, Ms. Azlin. The next question will be Mr. Theebashini to answer. So, when the victims reach out for the protection, and the government will give their protection order for the victims, do you believe the protection order is effective? And if it does, why? And if it doesn't, why?
Thank you. Fundamentally, it's helpful. On top of the fact that are 2 other types of protections orders, namely interim protection order (IPO) and emergency protection order. Nonetheless, we do not have enough information and experience on the practicality of these protection orders to protect the victims of domestic abuse. But what we can say is that having these orders is a protection service we can provide to our most vulnerable.
Yeah.
Thank Thank you.
So in the case of women victims as well, usually if it's emergency, they would go for EPO that they can find, or they can do without having to go to the police station. They can just call the hotline, and the hotline would help them to get the EPO for 7 days just to protect them then and there. But sometimes the problem is, from my experience before years back, is the shelters lah, particularly because sometimes shelter is not enough. So we need to bring them to a safe house or a safe place. And IPO is, of course, Miss Theebashini, they have to go to the police station, and they have to file the report, right? And I heard from you as well, there is also going to be a move to have this to do for children that can do online reporting. Is it true?
Yeah,
What
we
is it?
are
Sorry.
working on it to have a chatbot so that these children can feel safe to tell us. So we are working on it. Yeah.
Thank you, Ms. Azlin and Mr. Theebashini. Ms. Theebashini. So the next one is I want to ask on the penal code. As I read on article, it is said that the penal code section 375A says that a husband that causes hurt to his wife to have sexual intercourse will be jailed for maximum 5 years. Is this enough to provide compensation for the victims?
Okay, I try to avoid answering questions on the act because of unfamiliarity to the acts and legal cases or provisions in the Malaysian context. But apart from the Act 521 for counselling for both perpetrator and victim, it is like what Ms. Theebashini said just now, maybe fundamentally it may assist in domestic violence cases. But at the same time, apart from this, there must be also restorative justice. So when we talk about restorative justice, we talk not only helping the victims, but also helping the abusers. All right. And when we have restorative justice, we have to have intervention or prevention that would help them to disengage themselves from this pattern of abuse. Then can we bring about changes to domestic violence cases in Malaysia? So again, apart from restorative justice, from the legal aspects of the justice system, education or awareness is also important.
Okay, if I may, can I, yeah. Okay, punishment for crimes under the penal code, right, should not be equated to compensation, as compensation normally functions in the form of monetary relief. But when a husband commits that act, he's charged under criminal prosecution. If we are not mistaken, the wife does not get any monetary relief from such prosecution other than physically separating the wife and husband throughout the imprisonment of or the fine fixed. If a wife wants to demand for compensation, she's allowed to do so in a civil proceeding of a divorce petition for the pain and suffering caused by the husband, but the amount is also to be assessed by the court. Thank you.
Thank you to Ms. Theebashini and Dr. Azlin. But I have one question more on the penal code for you, Mr. Theebashini. Ms. Theebashini, sorry. According to Act 521 of the Domestic Violence Act, the law provide reconciliatory counselling for both perpetrator and victims. Under these circumstances, do you think this service is appropriate for the victims and the abuser to do it together?
Okay. For any law regulated in this society, there is never one size that fits all. If spouses are no longer in amicable terms, a reconciliatory counseling may not be effective. But it is an attempt to ensure a harmonious dispute resolution. But to say it is appropriate, it is for the victims to answer that. Some may feel that it is helpful, some are penalized by the officers themselves for not being a good enough spouse. So I would say it is case by case basis. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bashini. So while the abuser get their punishment and the victims get their protection, so do the government put any allegation to end this domestic abuse? Do they have any plan besides of only just punish and protection to stop the cycle of domestic abuse?
Okay, one of the biggest loopholes in this current legislation of domestic violent abuse is that only protects members of a family who are legally married. Therefore, the law is turning a blind eye to couples who are not legally unionized yet. But statistics show that individuals in an unmarried relationship are also at a high risk of being abused. We believe Malaysia should not be in denial that many of our fellow Malaysians are already in a relationship, but victims of abuse cannot seek any help or justice due to the limitations of our current DVA. This also means foreign spouses are more vulnerable to being abused due to the lack of legal documents for the same. Our opinion is that when the society is crying for help, those painful and heartbreaking cries, the government and the law have a role to hear the cries, but not to deny or invalidate, but to hear. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Theebashini, for the explanation on the ordinance and law exists in Malaysia right now. So one thing that is interesting is because the government, the authorities are also providing the emergency protection order and interim protection order for the victims. So we know from this that the victims are safe and at least being under protection of a trusted authority. And jumping to the next question, as according to our theme for today, empathy and inclusivity. So I can direct this question to Dr. Azlin about how can we actually empathize with victims of domestic abuse?
Okay, so the question is, don't judge, empathize. So how can we build empathy with those victims of domestic violence and abuse? When we look at one of the models proposed in 2019 by Haywood ETAL, it's called the Trivership model. In one of the variable in the model that I would like to bring up today when we talk about empathy is sharing of story. Now, if you could recall the snapshot that, the screenshot I shared with you about a woman trying a cry for help of her situation, many women need to be given a safe space to share their stories, empowered to share, so that they are more easily being guided to help that are available to help the condition. So there are three parts of empathy that I would like to bring here today. One is hearing you. Hearing you means listening. Listening means you don't judge. Sometimes, of course, we are inclined to say, oh, this happened all the time. You know your husband is doing this to you. Why don't you just walk out of the marriage? Just divorce him. So there are many of times when victims thought about ending their marriage, but then at the very last minute, they would say no. And this is because they thought about the children, what the society would think about them, how they are a failure in marriage. So hearing or providing a listening, providing listening, right? Listening to these so-called victims would help the situation. Secondly is feeling you. So when we talk about empathy, we always say, you know what is empathy? We say, oh, putting yourself in the shoes of the other person. So feeling you means that you have to believe that it really happens, because sometimes, you know, the victims, they wouldn't show you that, oh, you know what, I've been boxed by my husband last night, he wrestled me and I have all blue black. No, victims won't do this. So many of times, even their own siblings who are very close to them didn't know this abuse happened until after the death of the victim, many cases. And then they would recall, oh, no wonder she said to me before, I wish I don't have to go home. For example, this is true case. So feeling you means you give validation to the person who is sharing with you about her plight, and also do not judge, meaning that you try to accept what was being told, but at the same time, you don't be angry if that person seems to be helpless and hopeless in that situation. And finally, healing. So through hearing, through feeling, it will lead to healing. Healing slowly, the victim will feel that, oh, someone hears me, someone understands me, I can do something to improve my situation or condition. All right. And then how to reach out and give support. How to empathize. Again, giving emotional support, like feeling just now, being non-judgmental, acknowledge their feeling, tell them that abuse is not their fault, and of course, at the same time, you educate yourself and also the victims about domestic violence and the resources available in Malaysia on how to help them. Okay, thanks.
Thank you so much. So I believe Dr. Azlin has already covered on the last question also, which is the last question is, how do we include them in the society? And now we understand that how can we actually include the empathy and inclusivity to make our to encourage our members of society to be more inclusive in handling domestic abuse cases. And I believe we have come to an end of our session, but before we conclude the session, maybe as what Dr. Azim mentioned earlier, and we can also open the floor to question to participants. If there's any question to ask to both of our speakers today, participants can unmute your mic if you have question.
If there's no question from the audience, I think I want to ask that's the one question which I had asked Ms. Theebashini. So, Dr. Azlin, from your opinion, why the abuser and the victims get their punishment and the protection? So, how can we stop this cycle of the violence, the abuse? How can we stop it? The cycle.
First, it has to be coordinated community response. So if you know one of the theories known as that Bronfenbrenner, Bronfenbrenner ecology theory, there are a lot of factors that may encourage abuse. So to end the cycle of domestic violence, every part of the community has a role to play. So we talk about administrative, criminal justice system, the NGOs plays very important role, the health services, we talk about psychologists, mental health, counselors, the education system. Importantly also is the healthcare professionals. We're talking about medical doctors. This would be Ms. Theebashini in the future, yeah, Dr. Theebashini. Because why? Many studies indicated that many of these abuse victims, the first frontline person they would try to share their abuse would be these medical doctors. But sometimes the medical doctors are not trained. Even if they are trained, perhaps they do not have time to go into details what actually happened. But I know that there are already resources like questionnaires that can guide medical doctors on how to respond to women who came into them complaining of violence. Frontline staff clinics have to be given necessary information about the type of help. And then teaching in schools about healthy relationships. We talk about not only primary, we talk about all generation, tertiary education as well. And then up to the, what, apa tu, sebelum nikah, we have this what? The kursus kahwin. All right, it should be part of it as well. And then, of course, national awareness campaign. Okay, so that the society knows that domestic abuse and violence is unacceptable and what kind of healthy relationships should be in a household or in a marriage.
Yeah, I would also like to add, I think how we can stop this cycle is like the society should stop normalizing abusive relationship, because it is quite normal now that we see a lot of movies that romanticize abusive relationship, especially on Netflix. There are like numerous movies that actually portray those kind of abusive relationship, and people are praising and thinking that it is okay to be in those kind of relationship, and there's somehow hope, you know, like it's very romantic for the woman to be a savior for the man, the abusive man, you know. It's kind of messed up, but I think we should stop normalizing that.
Exactly, Hani. I think it's also individual choices. When we talk about domestic abuse, it's of course it's a learned behavior. It's also conditioning. But we talk here about it. It is a choice. You can choose to not hit your wife or your husband. You can choose to step away, just like what Islam says lah. If you cannot control yourself, either you take wudu or you step out of the house and you don't encourage aggressive behavior. So there are many steps that you can follow. So at the end of this is about our choice as a woman, who we want to be with, our courage to be ourselves, being an educated person that we are. But like I say, it's not as easy as this, all right? But we have that choice before we make the decision to marry someone or to be in a relationship with someone that we can do, that we can try to at least guide us when making big decisions in our lives.
Yeah, there's one question
Okay,
from the
one last
audience.
questions before we conclude the session. Yeah, this one was Sister Azira is asking, what are the differences between interim protection order and emergency protection order? Are these types of protection provided in the Domestic Violence Act or steps to get a protection? And when the victims eventually gets protection in the safe place residence, will the abuser not have contact with them, or how?
Can we get Ms. Theebashini to answer this?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, one moment now. Okay, it is like what I mentioned earlier in the Penal Code Section 375A. Yeah. And under the Another Domestic Violence Act, there will be a separation between the spouses, and there will be a limitation period, but it is renewable. The limitation period will be renewable. Okay, and yeah.
From what I understood, Miss Theebashini, EPO is for 7 days. So meaning that the woman who want to seek help will be given automatically, and it's very simple procedure. They can just call WAO hotline, and they would be granted with a 7-day protection, correct? And they can, what you said is now they can renew it, I'm not sure. But that would give space and safety for the woman to fled from the abusive husband. But interim protection order, the woman would have to go to the police station and file the report. All right, but if it's too dangerous, the situation, EPO should be applied first. All right, so when the victims eventually get protection, by right, the abuser should not have contact with them. You know where the problem lies here? It's the woman themselves maybe feel, oh, all right, I can see him for a while. But from the orders, by right, they cannot, or the abusers or perpetrators cannot have any close contact with the victims. So they should be safe in the safe house, residences, or shelters, as they are termed in the Malaysian context. But that's why in Budget 2021, they apply for more shelters to house these domestic violence victims. Thank you.
Thank you for the explanation. So I guess we are now at the end because it's already 11 o'clock. Thank you again to Dr. Azlin and Ms. Theebashini for the different opinions on the different elements of domestic violence, such as from the individual, governments, the courts, and the society. So I want to thank to the audience also. So I hope we all can take something from this session and benefit us. That's all from us. Thank you. See you again.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Assalamualaikum. Thank you, everyone.
Waalaikumsalam.
Thank
Thank you, Dr. Azlin. Thank you, Ms. Theebashini.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay.